Death has always been a part of entertainment. Humans have always been curious creatures. And while many governments have tried to restrict, and many religious activists actively try to preach and guilt trip the rest of us into not being fascinated by death, it's done squat. People will find a way around this, they always have. Though by now it's been sold to us one way or another that we must find death morbid and uninteresting, and that we should be ashamed or at least embarrassed by having such a fascination. So today we're going to talk about examples of death being used as entertainment throughout history and in the modern day, with a very solid changeover point in between. And I want to make it very clear, by death I mean human death, not animal death, because we would be here all day and I don't want to talk about it, and I'm sure you don't want to hear about it. Before we get started, we post death education and related videos every Friday, so if that's your kind of thing, consider subscribing to the channel. Now let's talk death as entertainment. From ancient Rome all the way through to the French Revolution and beyond, public executions drew in crowds by their thousands. They travelled great distances with great excitement to watch the show. Sure, it was the government's way of teaching morals, but the drinking and festivities that the public had around these public executions made that very easy to forget. In the Colosseum in ancient Rome, public executions took place in between gladiator bouts. Despite popular belief, most gladiator bouts didn't result in a gladiator dying because they were the celebrities of the time and worth a lot of money. But the public still wanted blood, and the government needed to reinforce its authority, and, well, a nice grisly public execution via wild animal covered all those bases. If we skip through to the 17 to 1800s, while remaining in Europe, beheadings in France and hangings in England brought out massive crowds. Indeed, a lot of the time, public executions were treated like public holidays, with workers and students being let out early so they wouldn't miss it. Many street vendors brought in big dollars during these days selling food, drink and souvenirs. This was particularly so if the person sentenced to death had been in the news a lot recently for their crimes. And these crowds were made up of all kinds of people, young and old, rich and poor, professional and unemployed. A great day out for the whole family. During the 1800s, Europe and the USA's populations were substantially growing, and large cities like London and New York were well into their millions already. But with life comes death, and the city's morgues overfilled with unclaimed bodies. Remember, trying to work out who a deceased person was back then was really down to a family member visually identifying them. All the usual means we have now just didn't exist yet. So many cities' morgues put bodies on display in the window or in an exhibition room to try and speed up identification before decomposition set in. Or that was their original intention. And the most famous and visited was the Paris morgue. By the end of the 19th century, every guidebook about Paris mentioned the morgue. It was a must-see tourist attraction. In 1885, a writer for the Crimson newspaper wrote about their trip to the morgue and described the following. Men are crowding and elbowing each other. Old hags are pointing towards the glass and croaking at one another. Pretty women are glazing at white faces in pity, but nonetheless thirsty greediness, upon some of the fascinating spectacle. Little children are being held aloft in strong arms, that they too may see the dreadful thing. And they do see, and they toss their tiny waving arms aloft and crow right gleefully. Sometimes visitors would visit the morgue and a criminal investigator would be there with a criminal. The idea being that upon seeing the result of their crimes, the accused would confess. Indeed, the morgue's well-attended displays earned frequent comparisons to theatre. A French novelist, for instance, called it a show that was affordable to all. And on the rare occasions that there were no bodies on display, angry crowds complained that death had allowed itself an intermission that day without thinking of their good pleasure. Thus, it could be said that these morgue visitings were similar to true crime documentaries and fictional crime shows today, where visitors can speculate upon the cause and motive of a death. During the era of Victorian England, the field of archaeology was really hitting its stride. It was very much more about showmanship and the spectacle than solid research, and the public also took on this attitude about it. Before we continue, we did a death debate video on digging up the dead, which I would really encourage you to watch after this one, because this is about to slide into some seriously unethical behaviour. Now, while the West likes to think of itself as high and mighty about its healthcare system, it certainly wasn't always that way. And back in the 16 to 1800s, medical cannibalism was in full swing. Ancient Egyptian mummies, for example, were thought to cure many things: epilepsy, headaches, blood clots. And thus they were, well, straight up stolen. There's just no other way to put that. And shipped back to Europe. But Sam, I hear you say, when does the unwrapping parts of all this start? And I'm getting to that. By the 1800s, this homeopathic medicine was on its way out. But there had been a romanticising about ancient Egypt, with archaeology being in the media a lot of the time. Egypt mania had gripped Britain. And what better way to bring together the country's newfound love of science and the old-time love of the macabre with a mummy unwrapping party, which is exactly like it sounds. Now, it wasn't as far spread and common as some historians originally thought, but it did happen. The most infamous man in this practice was Thomas Pettigrew, a surgeon turned antiquarian, who made a lot of money selling tickets to and souvenirs from these parties. A mummy would be acquired and in front of an excited crowd of onlookers slowly unwrapped, revealing a face that had been hidden to the world for millennia. It is said that the crowd found it oddly beautiful and others found it delightfully horrifying. And those souvenirs that we just mentioned, yeah, they were bone fragments and bandages, and for the right price, large bones like the skull or the thigh bone. Luckily, this trend did die down within a few decades. I'd love to say it was because they wanted to respect the dead and preserve history, but more likely it was more of a, well, once you've seen one unwrapping, you've seen them all kind of deal. And society went on to find its next creepy fix. Remember, freak shows and insane asylum viewings were also popular at this time. The start of the 1900s is really where we see the changeover point for how death as a type of entertainment was used. It didn't diminish in any way, it just changed. Remember, quite a few things were happening around this time. Public executions were starting to take place behind closed prison walls. The funeral industry was accelerating the cutting of personalization of death rituals. And literature and the media were becoming accessible to the majority in a way it hadn't been before. In the USA, for example, the penny press was a tabloid-type newspaper. And at this time, it started printing more sensational and violent material. Indeed, newspapers in general would cover local murders in great gory detail, and film, which was starting to take off at the time, would often use violent topics to pull in audiences. Thus, society's bloodlust had simply gone from seeing death in person to using the media to help imagine it. Then we take a big leap towards the end of the 1900s, where technology and media have taken off, and we see and do things that our ancestors never thought would be possible. I'm sure you've all heard of the Body Worlds exhibit, the skinless, plasticized bodies shaped in various poses. While it seldom comes to Australia anymore, it's still successfully exhibiting in North America and Europe. The creators say the primary goal of the exhibit is to get people thinking about preventative health care and, I quote, to inspire visitors to become aware of the fragility of their bodies and to recognize the atomical individual beauty inside each of us. I suppose, hey, come and gawk at the dead people, was a bit on the nose and probably likely to set off the government radar. Now, of course, there are educational components to this exhibit, as they say. But education typically doesn't engage the masses and make money. Curiosity and the macabre do. Similar to how public autopsies have had their moment in the spotlight, these exhibits also use human instinct of, oh look, weird thing, to bring in audiences. And there's nothing wrong with that. We recently did a video on why the Paris catacombs were created, which I'll link below. And in that, we mentioned how it was receiving visitors long before it was even officially open to the public. Indeed, this could be classed as a historical and modern example. More than 6 million people visit each year. And it isn't just Paris. Ossuaries around the world receive huge amount of visitors each year. People are fascinated by them. Some will claim that they visited because of the history or the architecture or the artful way they're presented. And it's not to say this isn't true. It's just that death is a strong part of all of these things. And if you're interested in history or architecture, you're going to come across a lot of death. But why hide from that? Why feel ashamed to say that you're going to visit the Paris catacombs to see the dead? Millions of other people are doing it, so it's obviously not uncommon. This is another one of those controversial issues, and we go into great depth about it in our death debate video, which I would link below. Nevertheless, there is a reason that human bodies in museums are such big attractions. Many large and famous museums around the world have bodies on display, along with many small, unregulated museums. It's like they all looked at each other in agreement, saying, well, we can't have an ancient Egyptian exhibit without a mummy. Which is a bit sad considering how much the ancient Egyptians managed to achieve. Bog bodies, those of saints, monks, and other ancient people are all on display. And let's be honest, they wouldn't be if people didn't want to see them. Again, there is a historical element to this, the whole putting a face to the history thing. But we also need to own up to it also being a bit like a car crash. You want to look away, but a bigger part of you wants to gawk at it. Death in the media is where the real change between historical and modern day is seen. The news makes a huge spectacle upon reporting upon every death that they could possibly find, rather than the actual news. And I'm sure we've all had that moment of, why are you reporting this? High-rating movies and TV shows are based on crime, murder and death, commonly with dozens of people being killed within the first few minutes if you're watching a great action movie. Many best-selling video games are straight up based on murder. Social media is flooded by live content of suicides and mass shootings which get shared over and over by millions. And these are just the straight-up examples. And while much of this relies on technology, that change occurred immediately after public executions went behind closed doors and the funeral industry took over. People nowadays like to say, well, I just watch crime shows for the whodunit. People back then were just uncivilized. Yeah, gotta love a bit of human arrogance, right? Well, remember back at the beginning of this video where I mentioned the Paris morgue viewings and people wanting to see criminal investigations unfold? Same deal, for the same reason. Oh, well, I would never go and see that. That's disgusting, they huff. But the many millions who view bodyworks exhibits, bodies in museums and various ossuaries around the world kind of contradict that theory. Also shows that they probably have never seen a dead body, such as at a funeral, which is quite frankly troubling. I thought I'd add this one as perhaps an unsettling look into the future, though it wouldn't shock me if it's already happening. Hunting humans for sport. Because let's be real here, there are those individuals out there who love to kill animals just to hang them on their wall. And the less said about them, the better. There has also been rumours for years about kill rooms on the dark web where individuals will pay to watch someone get murdered. And, well, the rich tend to get what they want one way or another. Now, it can't be confirmed, and it may just sound good to market a movie, but when the Hostel movies came out, the writer and director said the idea for the movie came about from a website he came across where you could travel to Thailand to kill a person for fun for the budget price of $10,000. Considering what many people will pay for and what many governments around the world will let you get away with, I don't think we'd be surprised to find out that these rumours became fact within the next few decades. Deplorable and sickening, yes. but not a surprise. What other ways do you see death being used as entertainment these days? Let us know in the comments. This video is to highlight the fact that human beings have always been interested in death, no matter if it's supposed to be normal interest at that time or not. It is human instinct to be curious about the unknown. It's part of survival. And wanting to learn about death and see death is nothing to be ashamed of. Death is a big part of history, architecture, art, science, and many other popular subjects. However, there is a line, and various societies are trying to work out where that line is. What do you think? And with that in mind, click the like button and go talk death.